The desert was unusually still that evening, as if holding its breath before a storm. The young woman, Eliza Hart, guided her mule along the narrow trail leading back from the river. She had come farther than she intended in search of water, her small canteen nearly empty. The sun had dipped low, spilling orange fire across the ridges, and she wanted to reach home before darkness swallowed the land. Yet something, some faint metallic sound carried by the wind, made her pause. At first she thought it was only the ringing of her own equipment, but when she stopped moving, the sound came again, the clink of iron against stone. Cautious but curious, she tethered her mule and followed the noise through the scattered mesquite. The sight she stumbled upon rooted her to the earth. An Apache man sat slumped against a wooden post, thick chains binding his wrists and ankles. His dark hair hung in matted strands, his chest bare except for blood and dust streaked across his skin. The iron cuffs had rubbed his flesh raw. He did not lift his head at her approach. His eyes remained closed, as if he had already given up on life. Eliza's heart thundered. She had heard of warriors taken prisoner, dragged from their lands to be displayed or executed. But she had never seen one so close, never seen one broken by iron. He looked both dangerous and pitiful, like a caged wolf, one moment fierce, the next moments from collapse. Her first instinct was to flee. She was a settler's daughter, raised on warnings of Apache raids, taught that these men were enemies. Her father used to say, "Don't look them in the eye, don't give them a chance because they'll take everything." But standing there, she saw not a savage, but a man, exhausted, wounded, breathing raggedly against chains that cut deeper each time he moved. The post itself was part of an old outpost, long abandoned by soldiers. Empty whiskey bottles and fire. Pits suggested bounty hunters had been here recently, but now the place was silent. Had they left him to starve? Were they coming back? Eliza's mouth went dry. Her conscience pulled her one way, fear the other. She took a hesitant step closer, her boots crunching against the dirt. His eyes opened then, sharp, startlingly alive, though clouded with suspicion. They locked on hers, and she froze. Neither spoke at first. The only sounds were the rasp of his breathing and the faint rattle of the chains when he shifted. Then, hoarse and low, he muttered something in his own tongue. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone carried desperation. I don't know what you're saying," she whispered, more to herself than him. He tilted his chin toward the iron locks at his wrists, a clear gesture despite their language barrier. The meaning struck her like a stone. He wanted freedom. Her stomach tightened. Unlocking him would mean betraying everything her community believed. To free him was to side with him and against her own. If the bounty hunters returned and found her here, she would be branded a traitor, perhaps even punished with him. But the longer she stood there, the heavier the sight became. She thought of her younger brother, how easily his spirit had dimmed when he'd been ill and confined to bed. No one deserved chains like these. Her hand drifted to the pouch at her belt where she kept a small knife. Not enough to break thick iron, but perhaps enough to pry or weaken a link if she dared. The Apache's eyes followed the movement, glinting with something she could not name. Hope? Distrust? A silent challenge? Eliza's pulse raced. She looked over her shoulder at the empty trail. No one was coming. The sky darkened further. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Her fingers tightened around the knife. She took one step closer to the chains, and in that moment, hesitant, trembling, her world shifted forever. Eliza's breath came shallow as she crouched before the chained Apache. The smell of dust, sweat, and old blood hung heavy in the air. She could feel his gaze burning into her as she slid her small knife from its sheath. Her hands trembled, not just from fear of him, but of what this decision meant. The iron cuffs were thick, far too strong for her blade to cut through. Still, she ran her fingers over the lock, testing its edges. It wasn't crafted by a blacksmith of skill, but by some hurried bounty hunter who valued quick shackling over durability. Perhaps with enough leverage, she could pry it open. The man shifted, the faint clink of his chains loud in the gathering night. She flinched back, the knife catching a flicker of orange light as the last rays of sun slipped behind the horizon. He held her eyes, and though his face remained unreadable, there was a weight in his expression, a mixture of defiance and a silent plea. "Why am I doing this?" she muttered under her breath. She could hear her father's voice, stern and unyielding. "If you ever cross paths with one of them, you turn away. If you don't, you won't live to regret it." But here she was, defying that warning. Her conscience gnawed at her. This man was dying. If she left him, his blood would be on her hands as much as the ones who chained him. With a determined exhale, she wedged the knife's tip into the narrow seam of the lock. Metal groaned faintly. The Apache's eyes sharpened with sudden intensity, as if the faintest spark of hope had awakened something in him. The work was slow, each movement filled with the risk of discovery. Every creak of the post made her head snap around, expecting to see torchlight or the sound of hooves, but the night remained still. Finally, with a strained snap, the lock gave way. The cuff sprang loose, falling into the dirt with a dull thud. Eliza froze, heart pounding at the sound, but the wilderness remained silent. He flexed his raw wrist, wincing, and then watched her expectantly, as if testing how far she would go. Her throat tightened. One wrist undone meant she could still walk. Away. She could tell herself she had tried, that she wasn't responsible for the rest. But when she looked into his face, lined with pain, dirt, and something unbroken, she couldn't stop. She went to work on the second cuff. This time, his free hand steadied the chain to keep it quiet, a surprising gesture of cooperation. She swallowed hard at his nearness, aware of the strength in him, even after days of captivity. It was not lost on her that once freed, he could turn on her in an instant. The second lock cracked open, then the irons on his ankles. At last, the Apache was free. He rose slowly, taller than she expected, his frame lean but coiled with power. The chains slipped from his body like a snake shedding its skin. For a tense moment, he simply stood there, towering over her in the twilight. Eliza's knife felt pitiful in her hand. She knew that if he chose, he could end her life with a single strike. Instead, he lowered his head briefly, an acknowledgement, though not quite gratitude. His voice rasped, broken but clear. Free. The single word sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped past her, scanning the horizon like a hawk before turning toward the shadows of the desert. Eliza hesitated, staring after him. She could still return to her mule, still pretend this never happened. But the chains lay at her feet, damning evidence of her choice. The bounty hunters would know someone had freed him. And if they found her nearby, suspicion would fall squarely on her. Her chest tightened with a sudden realization. She hadn't just freed him, she had bound her own fate to his. The Apache turned back, motioning with a sharp jerk of his chin. His meaning was clear. If she wanted to live, she had to follow. Eliza's heart pounded as she took her first step into the darkness beside him, the weight of her decision pressing heavier than the desert night. From this moment forward, there was no turning back. The desert night closed in around them, heavy with silence and stars. Eliza struggled to match the Apache's long strides as he moved swiftly across the scrub, barefoot but sure-footed, as if the land itself whispered guidance to him. Her skirts caught on thorn bushes, her boots slipped on loose gravel, and every few steps she stumbled, but he never slowed. "Wait, please," she gasped, clutching at her side. He glanced back once, eyes narrowed, and then stopped, standing, still like a shadow carved from stone. His gaze traveled over her clumsy form, her dress, her boots, the awkward bundle of her canteen and knife. A faint exhale left his lips, Not quite a sigh, not quite impatience, but an acknowledgement. She was no warrior, no scout, and yet she had chosen this path with him. He motioned for her to follow more closely, then continued at a pace that still stretched her strength but kept her from collapsing. Behind them, faint on the wind, came the distant baying of dogs. Eliza froze. The bounty hunters had returned. The Apache stiffened too, his head tilting as he listened. Then he moved faster, guiding her toward a shallow ravine hidden by rocks. He slipped into it silently, pulling her down with him. They crouched together in the darkness, the cool stone pressing against their backs. Eliza's heart pounded so loudly she feared the hunters would hear it. The barking grew nearer, joined by the clatter of hooves. Torchlight flickered on the horizon, casting wild glows across the desert brush. The Apache placed a calloused hand gently but firmly over her mouth, silencing her breathing. She froze, her whole body taut, the warmth of his skin startling her. His eyes, sharp even in the dark, held hers for a brief moment, commanding silence more powerfully than words. The hunters passed close, too close. She could hear their curses, the snapping of reins, the angry mutters about the prisoner escaping. One voice growled, "Whoever freed him's dead when I find him." Eliza's stomach knotted. They would hang her without hesitation if they knew. The dogs sniffed wildly near the rocks. One pawed at the edge of the ravine. Eliza's pulse thundered. But the Apache moved his other hand, pulling from the dirt a small stone, which he tossed deftly into the brush a few yards away. The clatter drew the dogs off, their barks shifting toward the false trail. Moments later, the hunters rode after the sound, torches bobbing as they disappeared into the distance. Only when silence returned did the Apache release his hand from her mouth. Eliza inhaled shakily, realizing her body had gone stiff as stone under his touch. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saved us." He did not reply. Instead, he listened again to the night air, then rose and motioned for her to follow. She obeyed, though her legs still trembled. They pressed deeper into the wilderness, guided by the stars. Hours passed in weary silence, broken only by the rasp of her breathing and the steady rhythm of his. The air grew colder, and her thin dress offered little protection. She wrapped her arms around herself, teeth chattering. The Apache noticed. He stopped, pulled something from the ground, a broad yucca leaf, and split it with practiced precision, weaving strips together with astonishing speed until he fashioned a rough but warm covering. He draped it across her shoulders without a word. Eliza's throat tightened. She had freed him, but now he was keeping her alive. Finally, when the horizon blushed with the first light of dawn, they found a small hollow beneath an overhang of red rock. He motioned for her to rest there. She sank to the ground, exhausted, her body aching from the night's flight. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, she realized the truth pressing down on her. She was no longer a settler's daughter, no longer safe in the life she had known. By freeing him, she had condemned herself to the same fate. She was a fugitive now, and the man beside her, the one she had feared and pitied, was the only chance she had to survive. When Eliza awoke, the sun was high, casting golden light over the red cliffs. Her body ached from sleeping on stone, and her mouth was dry with thirst. For a brief, blissful second she thought she had dreamt everything, the chains, the escape, the hunters, but then she turned her head. The Apache was there. He sat a few paces away, sharpening a jagged piece of flint against another stone. His movements were fluid, precise, as though each scrape carried meaning. The sight made her heart lurch. He was free now, powerful, and she was utterly at his mercy. The memory of his hand covering her mouth in the night still burned in her mind. He had silenced her to protect them both, but the intimacy of the act lingered. She wrapped the rough yucca covering tighter around herself, unsure whether to thank him or stay silent. He glanced at her briefly, eyes unreadable, then returned to his work. He said nothing, but when he noticed her fumbling with her empty canteen, he stood and motioned for her to follow. Reluctantly, she obeyed. They walked until they reached a cluster of cottonwood trees, where a thin trickle of water seeped from the rocks. Eliza dropped to her knees, filling the canteen eagerly before drinking. The Apache knelt as well, cupping water in his hands. When she lowered the canteen, she forced herself to speak. I should explain. About why I freed you. He looked at her, his dark eyes steady but hard. Why? The word was heavy, his accent rough but clear enough. Eliza faltered. Why had she done it? Compassion? Guilt? Some half-formed rebellion against the cruelty she had grown up seeing? She tried to find the words. Because no one deserves chains. Not like that. Not left to die. For a long moment, he studied her. Then he gave the barest nod, neither approval nor dismissal, before returning to drink. The silence between them grew thick. She wanted to ask his name, but fear of prying held her tongue. She wanted to tell him hers, but wondered if he cared to know. They were strangers bound by circumstance, two people who should have been enemies. As the day wore on, they climbed higher into the rocky hills to stay out of sight. The Apache led the way, his instincts guiding them through the land with an ease Eliza could only marvel at. He seemed to know every bird call, every shadow, every shift in the wind. She, by contrast, stumbled and lagged, earning the occasional sharp glance from him. At one point, her boot slipped on loose gravel, sending her crashing to her knees. Pain shot up her leg. She hissed, trying to rise, but her ankle throbbed. The Apache was at her side in an instant. For a moment she thought he might leave her behind, but instead he crouched, examined the ankle with quick, efficient hands, then tore a strip from the hem of her skirt to bind it. His touch was firm, not gentle, but careful enough to steady her. "You slow," he said flatly when he finished, meeting her eyes. Eliza bristled, cheeks hot. "I didn't ask to come with you." He rose, towering over her. "You free me. Now you hunted too." His voice carried no malice, only truth. Her stomach clenched. He was right. By unlocking those chains, she had tied herself to his fate, whether she wanted to or not. That night, as they rested in another rocky hollow, Eliza lay awake, staring at the stars. The distance between them seemed enormous, even though he sat only a few feet away. Yet every time the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves on the horizon, she felt the truth settle deeper. Whatever distrust lay between them, survival now depended on both of them. They were an alliance born of desperation, uneasy and fragile. But without it, they would not live to see another dawn. By the third day, Eliza's legs were raw with blisters, and her throat burned from dust. Every step felt heavier than the last, but the Apache never seemed to tire. He moved with the quiet precision of a hawk gliding on air, every sense alert. Every decision purposeful. Eliza envied that strength, though she also feared it. She had no doubt that if not for him, she would already be dead in the desert. And yet, each time she remembered the sound of the chains falling from his wrists, she wondered if she had loosed more than a man. Perhaps she had loosed danger itself. The answer came sooner than she expected. That afternoon, they heard gunshots echoing across the canyon. Both froze. The Apache crouched low, pressing his ear to the ground. After a tense moment, he whispered a single word. "Riders." Eliza's stomach dropped. The bounty hunters. They scrambled for cover, slipping into a narrow fissure between boulders, just as the sound of hooves grew nearer. The Apache pulled her down beside him, one hand raised to silence her, the other clutching the jagged flint blade he had shaped into a weapon. Through the cracks in the rocks, Eliza saw them. 5 men on horseback, rifles slung across their backs, dogs straining at their leashes, Their faces were hard, eyes sweeping the land with suspicion. "There!" one shouted, pointing to a faint trail in the dirt. Her heart sank. The prints were hers. The Apache muttered something sharp in his own tongue, frustration lacing the sound. Then, without warning, he seized Eliza's wrist and pulled her deeper into the rocks, forcing her through a narrow passage that scraped her skin raw. She bit her lip to stifle a cry. A stone tore at her arms, but she followed, fear lending her strength. They emerged on the other side of the ridge, the hunters' voices echoing close behind. Eliza's chest tightened as the baying of the dogs rose, closer, louder, frantic. The Apache pointed to the riverbed below, dry and cracked. He leapt down first, motioning urgently for her to follow. She hesitated, glancing at the steep drop. His glare cut through her fear. She slid after him, landing hard but safe. He knelt quickly, sweeping branches over their tracks, then guided her down the riverbed where stone would mask their passage. For hours they walked in silence, the sun baking their backs, the chase behind, them relentless. By dusk, they reached a cluster of caves carved into the canyon walls. The Apache chose one with a narrow mouth, pulling Eliza inside. They collapsed against the cool stone, both gasping for breath. Eliza's hands shook as she unfastened her canteen. "They're not going to stop, are they?" The Apache shook his head. His voice was low, steady. "Hunters want blood, yours, mine." Her stomach twisted. The reality hit her harder than the desert sun. There would be no turning back. No pleading for mercy. She was as much a fugitive as he was now. Silence stretched, broken only by their ragged breathing. At last, the Apache spoke again. "You. No survive without me." The bluntness of the statement stung, though she knew it was true. "Maybe not," she whispered. "But maybe you wouldn't survive without me either. Who freed you?" For the first time, his expression softened. Not a smile, not quite, but something that flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. Outside, the distant barking of dogs rose again, echoing against the canyon walls. The hunters were closing in. Eliza clutched the knife at her belt and glanced at the Apache. She realized then that, whatever mistrust still lingered between them, their fates were bound tighter than any chain, and the noose of pursuit was drawing ever closer. The 6th day in the wilderness broke with a sharp chill. Eliza woke shivering, her teeth chattering despite the yucca covering he had given her. Her stomach cramped from hunger. She had eaten nothing more than roots and a handful of berries since the flight began. The Apache rose with the dawn, his movements deliberate, quiet. He disappeared into the rocks, leaving her alone in the cave. Panic flared in her chest. Had he abandoned her? Had she freed him only for him to leave her behind? Minutes dragged like hours until he returned, carrying a rabbit dangling from his hand. His expression revealed nothing, but there was a faint pride in the efficiency of his hunt. He knelt without a word, skinned the animal with his flint blade, and set it to roast over a small fire of dry twigs. The scent of cooking meat made Eliza's stomach twist painfully. She swallowed, embarrassed by how desperate she felt. When the meat was done, he tore a piece free and offered it to her first. She hesitated, then accepted, her fingers brushing his rough hand. The food was tough, smoky, but it was nourishment. She chewed slowly, savoring every bite. "You know nothing of land," he said finally, breaking their long silence. Eliza bristled. "I know enough to survive." He shook his head, tearing into his portion. "Without me, you die first night." She wanted to argue, but the truth was too sharp to ignore. She lowered her gaze, ashamed yet stubborn. "Maybe. But I freed you. You'd be dead in chains now if not for me." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gave the faintest nod, as though conceding a point in a battle neither had asked for. That day they traveled farther into the mountains. The air grew thinner, cooler, but water trickled more freely from hidden springs. Each time Eliza stumbled, the Apache steadied her without a word. Each time she lagged, he slowed, though his eyes carried a flash of impatience. By late afternoon, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the sky, rain lashing the rocks. They sheltered under an overhang, pressed close by necessity. The wind howled, cold and merciless, and Eliza shivered violently. Without hesitation, he shifted his blanket of animal hide from his shoulders and draped it around both of them. Their bodies pressed close, warmth shared. Eliza's pulse quickened at the contact. She told herself it was only survival, only necessity. But deep inside, she felt something stir that unsettled her more than fear. As the storm raged, she dared to speak. "What's your name?" He was silent for so long she thought he would ignore her. Then, quietly, he said, "Koa." "Koa," she repeated, tasting the name. It felt strong, like the man himself. "I'm Eliza." His eyes flicked to hers, briefly, then back to the rain. "Eliza," he echoed, his accent shaping it into something softer. That night, with the storm fading into mist, they shared the last of the rabbit by the fire. Eliza asked him about his people, though he answered only in fragments, his words clipped, cautious. She learned enough to glimpse his pain. Betrayal by scouts who had promised peace, capture by men who had sought only coin. For the first time, she saw not just a fugitive, but a man carrying wounds deeper than the ones iron had left on his skin, and, for the first time, Koa saw not just a settler's daughter, but a woman who had risked everything for reasons even she could not explain. They were still divided by distrust, by culture, by the hunt that drove them forward. But hardship was stitching them together thread by thread. In the wilderness, suffering had become their common language. By the 8th day, the line between enemy and ally had blurred so much that Eliza no longer knew which he was. Koa walked ahead of her, silent as always, his tall frame cutting against the vast horizon. She followed, her steps less clumsy now, her body slowly learning the rhythm of the wild. Something had changed between them since the storm. It wasn't trust, not fully, but the edges of their hostility had softened. The silence that once felt hostile now felt almost companionable. That morning, Koa handed her a small bundle of mesquite beans he had gathered. "Eat," he said simply. She accepted, chewing the tough pods with effort. "You always take care of me first," she murmured. He shrugged. "You slow, weak, must live." Eliza bristled. "You could be kinder about it." For a moment, his lips almost curved into a smile, though it never fully formed. Still, the spark of amusement in his eyes made her chest tighten strangely. Later, that day, as they crossed a shallow stream, her foot slipped on a mossy stone. She plunged into the water with a startled cry. The current wasn't strong, but the shock of cold stole her breath. Before she could regain her footing, Koa's hand seized her arm and hauled her upright. Water streamed from her hair and clothes as she stumbled to the bank, sputtering. He let out a sound, half laugh, half snort, that she had never heard from him before. "You clumsy," he said, shaking his head. Despite her dripping state, Eliza couldn't help but laugh, the sound bubbling out of her like it hadn't in months. The tension between them cracked, just for a moment, replaced by something lighter, something dangerously close to warmth. That night, they camped near the stream. Eliza spread her damp dress by the fire to dry, sitting wrapped in his hide covering. She watched him as he worked a strip of bark into rope with patient skill. His hands were steady, strong, and she wondered how many lives they had defended, or taken. "Do you ever wish," she asked quietly, "that you could just Stop running. Stop fighting. Koa paused, eyes lifting to hers. The firelight flickered across his face, sharpening the lines of pain and resilience. No, stop, he said after a long silence. Always war. My people fight to live. No choice. Her throat tightened. And me? What am I fighting for now? He studied her as if weighing her question, then said simply, freedom. The word settled deep in her chest, heavier than she expected. Freedom. She had thought she understood it. Choosing to free him, choosing to walk away from the world she knew. But now she realized freedom was not a single act. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was the fragile bond forming between them. When she lay down that night, the sound of his quiet breathing nearby was more comforting than she wanted to admit. She closed her eyes, knowing that if the hunters came, he would fight for her as fiercely as for himself. And when Koa lay awake staring at the stars, he thought of the woman who had risked everything for him. He did not understand her stubbornness, her softness, but he could not deny the strength it had taken to choose his life over her safety. Their bond was not spoken, not sealed with words. It was woven silently through laughter by the stream, through food shared by the fire, through the unshakable truth that they were no longer merely two fugitives. They were beginning to belong to each other. The mountains had grown steeper, and the air sharper with every breath. Eliza's body had toughened from the journey, but her spirit wavered. Each day seemed borrowed, each night hunted. She could almost feel the hunter's eyes on her back, though no one had appeared for days. Koa noticed her unease. He noticed everything. That morning, as they crested a ridge, he halted suddenly, his posture tense. Eliza followed his gaze, and her heart dropped. Below them stretched a canyon, wide and treacherous, its floor scattered with jagged rocks. On the opposite side rose sheer cliffs, and on their side, closing fast, were riders. Dust rose behind. Them like a storm. The hunters had found them. Eliza's breath caught. There's no way across, she whispered, panic tightening her throat. Koa's jaw clenched. He scanned the canyon edge, his eyes sharp, searching. Then he pointed to a narrow outcropping that jutted over the chasm. Beyond it, barely visible, in the haze, was a ledge on the far side. It wasn't a path, it was a leap. Eliza's stomach churned. We'll die if we try that. Die if we stay, he answered simply. The riders' shouts carried across the canyon, the glint of rifles catching the sunlight. They were too close. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears. She thought of the chains lying in the dust where she had freed him. Had that moment doomed her to this? Koa gripped her arm firmly, grounding her. His eyes locked with hers, unyielding but steady. Trust. Her throat tightened. Trust him. She barely trusted herself anymore. But the choice was cruelly simple: death behind them, or the unknown before them. The hunters' rifles cracked, bullets whining past. Eliza flinched as stone splintered at her feet. Koa pulled her toward the outcropping, his movements swift, certain. Her legs trembled, but she followed, every step carrying her closer to the edge of death. The wind howled in the canyon below, a voice warning of the fall. At the ledge, Koa turned to her, his chest rising and falling, his eyes blazing. Run! Jump! Eliza shook her head, terror flooding her veins. I can't! I'll fall! No. Fall, he said firmly. With me! The hunters were nearly upon them. Dogs barked, men shouted, hooves thundered. Eliza's heart raced so wildly she thought it would burst. Koa stepped back, took her hand in his rough grip, and together they ran. The ground vanished beneath them as they leapt into the void. For a suspended, breathless moment, Eliza felt weightless, the canyon yawning open beneath her like a hungry mouth. She wanted to scream, but the wind stole her voice. Then, with bone-jarring force, they landed on the far ledge. Koa stumbled but caught her, his arm locking around her waist, steadying her. The hunters skidded to a halt on the opposite side, curses echoing. One raised his rifle, but the distance was too great. They could only watch as the fugitives vanished into the maze of cliffs. Eliza collapsed against the rock, her chest heaving. She clutched Koa's arm, not from fear but from sheer disbelief. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly alive. He looked down at her, his face calm though his breathing was ragged. For the first time she saw not just strength, but something deeper in his gaze, a recognition of what they now shared. That leap had not only saved them, it had bound them. They were no longer merely running side by side. They were running as one. The leap across the canyon had bought them precious time, but not safety. The hunter's shout still echoed faintly in the distance, reminding Eliza that pursuit never truly ended. She and Koa pressed deeper into the cliffs, the terrain jagged and unforgiving, every step a test of will. By the 10th night, exhaustion weighed on Eliza like chains once had on him. Her legs quivered, her vision blurred, and every breath scraped her lungs raw. She stumbled more often, forcing Koa to slow their pace. She saw the frustration flicker in his eyes, though he never abandoned her. That night, they found shelter in a hollow of stone, a fireless camp to hide their smoke. Eliza collapsed against the wall, clutching her knees, fighting tears. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go on like this." Koa crouched before her, his expression unreadable. "Hunters near. You stop, you die." Her throat tightened. Maybe that would be easier. The silence that followed was heavy. Then, without warning, Koa took the canteen from his belt and pressed it into her hands. "Drink," he ordered. She shook her head. "That's yours. You need it more than me." His voice sharpened. "Drink." When she still hesitated, he pulled the stopper himself, tipped the canteen, and guided it to her lips. The water was cool, precious. She swallowed, tears stinging her eyes, not from weakness, but from the startling realization that he would give his own strength for her. The next morning, their test came. They had scarcely climbed out of the ravine when gunfire cracked across the rocks. Bullets whined past. Eliza screamed as a shot shattered stone beside her. The hunters had found them again. "Run!" Koa barked, pulling her forward. They dashed across the uneven ground, but the hunters were too close. Eliza's foot caught in a crevice and she fell hard, her ankle twisting painfully. Agony shot through her leg. Koa spun back immediately, crouching beside her. She gasped, "Go, leave me, they'll kill you if you stay." For a moment, his face hardened, his jaw set. Then, with a fierce determination, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The hunter's shouts grew louder. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric and flesh. He grunted but didn't slow. Blood darkened his skin, but still he carried her, leaping down the slope into a narrow gorge. Eliza clung to him, trembling. "You're bleeding." "No matter," he rasped. "You live." At the gorge's end, he spotted a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for one. He shoved her inside first, shielding her with his own body as bullets chipped the rock around them. She felt the impact of one strike against his side, heard his sharp intake of breath, but he never faltered. They pressed deeper into the darkness until the hunters' voices faded. Only then did Koa collapse against the wall, his body slick with blood and sweat. Eliza knelt beside him, frantic. "Why would you do this? Why risk your life for me?" His eyes found hers, fierce even through pain. "Because you risked yours. For me, chains, you break." He pressed a hand to his wound, wincing. "Now I protect." Her vision blurred with tears. In that moment, she understood. This was no longer about debt or survival. It was about loyalty, earned in hardship, sealed in sacrifice. She pressed her hands to his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. "Then we protect each other, always." Koa gave a faint nod, his strength wavering but his eyes steady. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It was forged in blood. The crevice became their refuge, a tomb of stone that smelled of earth and dampness. Eliza pressed against Koa's wound with strips of torn cloth, her hands shaking, her heart burning with fear. Every beat of his heart seemed to echo in the silence, fragile yet unyielding. For 2 days they hid there. Eliza tended him with what little she had, water from pooled rain, herbs she recalled from old remedies, whispered prayers in the dark. Koa bore the pain without complaint, his breath heavy but steady. She refused to let him slip away. On the 3rd dawn, he stirred, his strength returning. "We move," he murmured, his voice hoarse but resolute. Eliza wanted to protest, to demand rest, but she saw the fire in his eyes. He knew the hunters would not give up. Every day spent in hiding was another day for their enemies to close in. They emerged from the crevice to a new world. Morning sunlight painted the cliffs gold, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. Koa moved with caution, favoring his wounded side, but his spirit was fierce. Eliza stayed close, her resolve as firm as his. By midday, they reached the rim of a vast plain. Beyond it stretched endless grassland, rippling like waves in the wind. To Eliza, it looked like freedom. To Koa, it was home. But between them and that promise lay one last obstacle. The hunters had tracked them to the edge. Dust clouds rose on the horizon, riders closing fast. The thunder of hooves rolled like a storm. Eliza's stomach knotted. "They're here!" Koa's hand brushed the knife at his belt. "No more running!" Eliza froze. "You can't fight them all." His eyes locked with hers, steady and burning. "Fight for freedom. For you. For me." Her chest tightened. The thought of losing him was unbearable. She grasped his arm. "Then we fight together." The riders charged, their shouts carried by the wind. Gunfire cracked, the sharp scent of powder filling the air. Koa moved like a shadow, swift and deadly, using the rocks as cover. Eliza, trembling but determined, loaded the small pistol she had carried since the beginning. Her hands shook. But when the first rider closed in, she fired. The man toppled from his horse. The battle was chaos. Shouts, hooves, bullets. Koa fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost everything once and refused to lose again. Eliza stayed close, her fear transforming into something fiercer, sharper. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled upon a captive. She was his partner in the fight for survival. At last, the dust settled. The hunters lay scattered, their pursuit broken. The survivors fled into the horizon, unwilling to face the pair any longer. Silence returned to the plains, heavy but victorious. Eliza collapsed to her knees, breathless. Koa stood above her, bloodied but unbroken, his chest rising and falling like the rhythm of the earth itself. He extended a hand to her, pulling her to her feet. They looked out over the wide, untamed land before them. Freedom was not just a dream anymore. It was real, waiting, theirs to claim. Koa's voice was low but certain. "No more chains." Eliza met his gaze, her eyes wet with relief. "No more running." Hand in hand, they stepped onto the plain. Fugitives no longer. Two souls bound by trust, sacrifice, and the unyielding fire of survival. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs. Together, always,